The Figure in the Shadows by John Bellairs, Chapter 6. That morning at breakfast, Lewis asked Mrs. Zimmerman to pack a lunch for him. He said that he was going to stay down at school during the noon hour. Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman both smiled happily. They were glad that Lewis was going to have fun with the other boys instead of skulking at home like a fugitive. And when Lewis went out the door, they saw that he was grinning from ear to ear. "Rosarita has been a good influence on him," said Jonathan as he poured himself a second cup of coffee. "I hope she keeps it up." Mrs. Zimmerman stood there staring at the front door. She scratched her chin thoughtfully. "Maybe it's good," she said slowly, "but I can't help feeling that there's something funny about Lewis these days. I can't quite put my finger on it, but there's something wrong. Did you notice how tired he looked? Around the eyes, I mean. And yet he was raring to go. It's odd." Jonathan shrugged. "It's always odd when a boy like Lewis does something different. But I wouldn't worry about him. I think he knows what he's doing." Lewis hummed marching songs all the way to school. He really felt great. But when noontime came and he had eaten his lunch, he felt different. He began to get worried. By the time he had reached the edge of the playground, he could feel his courage ebbing away. Should he turn around and go home? Lewis paused, and he pulled himself together, patted the amulet, and walked forward in quick, nervous strides. It was a gray November day on the playground. The football and baseball fields were covered with frozen footprints and bicycle ruts. Puddles of ice lay here and there. Lewis saw a group of boys getting ready to play football. They were lining up to be chosen, and the two captains were flipping a coin to see who got first choice. As Lewis drew near, he saw one of the boys in the group was Woody, and once again Lewis's courage failed. He felt like going home, but he fought down his fear and stayed. Lewis slipped into the group of boys that were waiting to be chosen. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, hoping that no one would notice him. Near him, a boy was jumping up and down and slapping his sides. Near him, a boy who had been jumping up and down and slapping his sides stopped jumping and stared at Lewis as if he were a visitor from outer space. What was old Lardo doing here? One by one, the boys got picked until only two were left unchosen. They were Woody and Lewis. Woody glanced over at Lewis and grinned. "Well, if it ain't Lardass, did your uncle let you out of your cage today?" Lewis stared hard at the ground. The two captains were Tom Lutz and Dave Schellenberger. It was Tom's turn to choose, and he glanced from Woody to Lewis. Woody was good at sports, but the boys avoided choosing him because he was such a troublemaker. "Oh, well, come on, Woody," Tom grumbled. Woody walked over to the group of boys on Tom's side. For a minute, it looked as if Dave Schellenberger would tell Lewis to go home. That was what usually happened on the rare occasions when Lewis showed up to play games with the other boys, but this time, for some reason, Dave chose Lewis. He motioned for him to come over to his side. "Come on, fatty," he said. "We'll make you our center. Need some beef in the line." Lewis was in the game. He could hardly believe it. After the kickoff, Lewis's side wound up with the ball. Lewis stood there, bent over, legs wide apart, rubbing the football back and forth over the frozen ground. The quarterback started the long count. 23, 43, 24, 3, 0, 14. Suddenly Lewis felt a sickening shock. He had been staring at the ground, and now he was on his back, looking at the heavy gray sky. "Oops, sorry. Guess I jumped the gun." It was Woody, of course. "Hey, Woody, come on," yelled Dave. "Cut out that kind of crap, will you?" "I think Lardass here was offsides," said Woody, pointing down at Lewis. "I was not, and stop calling me Lardass." Lewis was on his feet now, red-faced and angry. "That's your name, Lardass," said Woody carelessly. "Got any other names?" Lewis hauled off and punched Woody in the stomach. Woody clutched at his middle. Pain and surprise were in his eyes. The punch really hurt. Several boys who were standing around gasped. Somebody yelled, "Fight! Fight!" And a circle formed around the two boys. Woody was angry now. He spat on the ground and swore. "Okay, you tub of guts," he snarled, moving with his fists up. "Now you're going to get it." Lewis backed away. He felt like turning and running. But now Woody was on him, swinging hard. The blows fell on Lewis's shoulders in a stinging rain. Lewis lunged and got his arms around Woody. Now the two of them were rolling over and over on the ground. Woody came out on top, and Lewis felt his head being pushed down into a frozen puddle. The thin ice cracked, and cold water bit into Lewis's scalp. Lewis looked up at the ring of expectant faces hovering against the sky. Woody was astride him, sneering and triumphant. "Go ahead, Lardass, tell him what your name is." Woody put his hand on Lewis's face and shoved. Icy water stung Lewis's ears. No. Go on, I said. Tell him your name. Woody dug his knees into Lewis's sides. It was like being caught in a nutcracker. Suddenly, Lewis lurched upward and Woody fell over on his back. Now they were rolling over and over, and this time Lewis came up on top. He was sitting with his full weight on Woody's chest, but Woody had a free arm. He reached up and punched Lewis on the ear. It stung, but Lewis didn't move. He grabbed Woody by the hair and banged his head on the ground. Come on, Woody, say you give up. Woody glared defiantly at Lewis. No. Lewis raised a fist. But then he hesitated. He had always been told that it was bad to hit someone who was down. Maybe he could just sit on Woody till Woody gave in. But as he was thinking this, some other power seized Lewis's hand and brought it down hard on Woody's nose. Blood gushed from Woody's nostrils. It ran down over his mouth and chin. Lewis jerked his hand back and clutched it to his chest, as if he were afraid of what it might do if he let it loose again. When he looked down, he saw that Woody was staring up at him, his eyes wide with fear. I give up, Woody stammered. Lewis got up and backed away. The boys who had been watching the fight looked from one to the other in disbelief. No one knew what to say. They all figured that Woody would wipe the earth with Lewis. Woody got up slowly. He was crying and wiping his bloody nose on his sleeve. One boy ran into the school to get a cold cloth to hold to Woody's nose, while others were advising him to hold his head back and press the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers. For the time being, Lewis was a hero. Dave Schellenberger slapped him on the back and said, "Way to go, baby!" Another boy asked him if he'd been doing exercises. Finally, when Woody's nose had been taken care of, the boys asked Lewis if he'd like to play football with them some more. Dave said he could be fullback if he wanted to, but Lewis said, "Gee, no thanks, fellas. I just remembered something I was supposed to do. I'll see y'all later." He waved and walked away. Lewis didn't really have anything that he had to do. He just wanted to be alone with his thoughts. So he wandered off to a quiet part of the playground and started pacing. And as he paced, he thought. He had figured that he would feel great after his victory, but he didn't. Strangely enough, he felt sorry for Woody, who had been showed up in front of those kids. Woody had had a reputation as a tough guy. Now everybody would start picking on him. And something else was bothering Lewis. He hadn't intended to punch Woody in the nose. It was as if someone had grabbed his arm and brought it smashing down. Lewis knew that the amulet had done it, but all the same, he didn't like it. He didn't like the idea of being jerked around like a puppet on a string. He had wanted magic help, but he had wanted the help to stay under his control. After he had paced a little more, Lewis pulled out his watch and looked at it. Lunch period was almost over. Maybe he would feel better if he told Rosita about what he had done, leaving out the part about the amulet, of course. Sure, that was a good idea. He would tell her all about his big fight with Woody, and she would be proud of him, and that would make him feel better about the whole business. Lewis knew where to find Rosita. She would be pitching in the girls' softball game. It was the wrong season for softball, but the girls weren't allowed to scrimmage around and get their skirts dirty in games like football, so they played softball all through the autumn until snow fell. Lewis arrived at the girls' softball diamond just as Rosita was firing the ball up to the plate. The batter, a girl with yellow braids, swung like somebody chopping wood. She missed. That was the end of the inning, and anyway, the bell was ringing for the kids to come back to school. As Rosita walked off the field, Lewis noticed that she had a disgusted look on her face, but as soon as she saw him, she brightened up. "Hi, Lewis," she called, waving. She stopped in front of him, made a hideous face, and put her fingers to her forehead like a gun that was going to blow her brains out. "Yeah," she said. "What's wrong?" asked Lewis. "Oh, nothing. It's just that Lois Carver is such a rotten batter. I strike her out every time she comes up to bat. This last time I pitched to her with my eyes shut just to see what would happen, but she struck out anyway." "She did?" Lewis was only half listening to what Rosita was saying. He wanted to tell her all about the big fight. "I got in a fight with Woody Mingo," he said. Rosita looked surprised. "You did? Is that where you got that thick ear?" "Yeah, but I gave him something worse. Pow! Right in the kisser." Lewis tried to imitate the punch he had used. Rosita glanced at him skeptically. "Oh, come on, Lewis. Stop telling stories. You don't have to lie to me. I won't make fun of you because you got beat up." Suddenly, Lewis became very angry. He turned on Rosita and yelled at the top of his voice, "Okay, if that's the way you feel, I'll get somebody else to be my best friend." He turned on his heel and stalked away, adding over his shoulder, "See you around!" Lewis marched off toward the school building. He walked fast and didn't look back. By the time he got to the door, he found that he was crying. And that is the end of chapter 6.